ruling, if it's somewhere between both, that this role was crystallized, whoever directs these massive culture institutions, to deal in this way with memory. What's interesting to mention is that it's an ongoing process, and it's a dialogue that sometimes does not even involve the art scene. So for instance, the Modern Dance School, which is where I studied, when I first joined, it was already being attacked, and already the government wanted to close it, because it was at the period where the Muslim Brotherhood, for the first time, won a significant number of seats at the parliament. Something like 15% or something like this of the parliament, which was unprecedented, of course. And the first thing that their representative at the time was Morsi, who later became president of Egypt. So this is around 2002 or 2004, somewhere in this period, decided that the Modern Dance School should be closed. It was his project. And there was many threats that there will be terrorist attacks on the school. Of course, the threats do not come officially from them, because they are a peaceful political and charity organization, unofficial organization. So the threats comes from the bad Islamists, not from the good Islamists. Which could mean that the threats are coming from the state security. Nobody knows who is playing which role in this big performance. And we had to install a metal detector on the gates. So every time as I enter to take my dance class, we have to pass through metal detectors, put your leotards through a big thing in case you're just hiding a bomb somewhere. And then you have to enter there and put a smile on your face and a hand on the bar and go and do an adagio or something. So I found it a bit troubling, and probably my colleagues did as well. Until one day where they sent us someone to do a report on the nature of the activity of the school, because it has to be controlled. Because this was the first time that there is a board running a cultural institution. And this board were all people from the independent art scene. So they were not teachers working with the Ministry of Culture, and they were not working with the Ministry of Education either. So of course this was catastrophic. There is a fissure in their system, and they do not understand it, and it has to be stopped. Not because it is teaching modern dance and therefore, or contemporary dance, and therefore dealing with parts of history that they choose to selectively ignore in arts curricula and art schools in Egypt. But because it was a system error, it was posing a system error to them. If this starts there, they do not know what it could do to the entire system. It is going to produce graduates who have lived for 3 years in this program at the Cairo Opera House, and these graduates are going to enter into the realm of the Cairo Opera House, get jobs there and start working, and they were not produced in the same systematic way that would continue this cycle of monopoly and memory politics procedures. So we had to film our dance classes to prove two things. One, that we are not teaching prostitution or homosexuality in the class. Two, that we were hardworking. So it was also about labor, physical labor. We had to film our classes and submit them to the parliament, and there were sessions where the parliament would sit and watch our dance classes. And that was still not enough. The parliament said, no, it still should be closed. So then there was a debate between one of my colleagues, myself, and Morsi about the necessity of a dance school in Egypt, which is, it's a hilarious video. And he refused to sit with us face to face because he does not want to mix with dancers, of course. So we had to record our statements on video and submit it to him, and he would answer to this live on some television program. Sadly enough, just a couple of months ago, the Modern Dance School was closed for good by a decision from the government under Morsi. Of course, this time they found a better argument, which is budget. But there is no budget to run the school, which is not an argument that holds any sustenance, because the school is half private and the students pay fees, and there is a fundraising plan happening with independent culture centers. So it's very clear that this is the ongoing project, and finally they succeeded. What's really funny is that this document, this video interview surfaced and was being circulated again about this joint video debate between Morsi and dance students, talking about the necessity of dance, and him saying it's not about aesthetics or ideology. This, back at the time, this is just because this is a structure that we don't understand. You have people there who are teaching things that we have no control of. It's not part of this. So there he openly states his problems, and now it is about budget, suddenly. Somewhere in all of these stories, with the burning of the Cairo Opera House, the establishment of a new one that is run by state security and the army, the destruction of the National Theatre and it being reconstructed, of course, under the supervision of the army. The rehabilitation of the Hanagir Theatre, the independent theatre which was famous for hosting independent theatre shows, at the same time for reporting many of these independent theatre shows, now has cameras installed backstage. And just a few weeks ago, one theatre director was called in by the police because he kissed his girlfriend backstage after premiere. He was happy and he kissed her. He had no idea, of course, that there are cameras backstage, which is shameful. The music library remains its control and full monopoly on all the documents there. So while we are working now in Cairo with my associates in Haraka to establish the first archive for Arab contemporary performing arts, which will be a pan-archive documenting the works in music, theatre and dance from the Arabic-speaking world, we have absolutely no access to this material. And the reason why such archives have to exist so that there is access to public on this material. But of course, given that there are all these insane performances of monopoly of memory and the security and the role of this who curates a collection being as problematic as I tried to explain a bit, within the ministry scene and within the state scene, the archive has to have two shadow archives outside of Egypt. So the same collection is going to be duplicated, one in New York and one in Köln in Germany. The kind of questions that are being raised on how and why the collection is being done, you could imagine what kind of questions they are. Interestingly enough, of course, never dealing with the artistic content, but dealing with how it is going to be screened, who is the audience, and how are they going to use it. Is it for research, or are they going to sell it? So it either has to do with how it will be capitalized on, or it has to do with how much access to information will this archive give. I remember when I asked Noura Farhat, when last month we were giving a talk again about memory politics in relation to archival practices, but also in relation to the people in charge of collecting things to preserve them and then opening them. And we screened parts of another video that she was doing interviews with people, asking them what do they know about l'Institut d'Egypte. And almost everybody said they don't know anything. They know where it is because sometimes they pass by it, because it's on a main street leading to Tahrir Square. So it is easy to pass through that street and to see it. But no one has been there. And then I thought I will ask other people that I know. I myself have not been inside because I tried and it was a very complicated procedure, even though I know that there is a very beautiful little wooden auditorium of some sort, or a wooden hall, which is supposed to be an architectural miracle. I was very curious to go, whether to visit the collection or just to see the place from the inside, and it was always impossible. Whether that, oh no, we closed early today, or oh no, today we have a special meeting of the board. Oh no, you do not have the permission from I don't know who, you should go where. Then they told me that some of the collection has duplicates in the National Archives, which was, again, for anyone who tried to access the National Archives, you know a bit what it is like in Egypt. But then I asked my professors, I asked my uncle who runs a major newspaper, and I asked my parents, and none of them managed to enter. The much older generation did enter before and did mention something very important, is that the board had regular meetings and that the board published the meeting points of what they were discussing, what they were curating, what they were planning in terms of events, what they were planning in terms of publications, editorial vision, a change in the focus on the arts section or in the scientific community within this Institut d'Egypte. I remember in the books that were being collected, seeing a few of these publications. I think it's around 1946 was the last edition that I found. After this, I can't remember whether they were burnt or it stopped in the late 40s, but I would say it probably continued and then we just lost them. Which again is about how information circulates in relation to all of these regime shifts. And then the other question that I would think of is what does this make an art scene look like? When you have the contemporary arts students, for example, if someone is studying contemporary dance now and they are 16 or 17, they would have never in their lives seen the work of choreographer Karima Mansour. The last time she performed in Egypt was 2004. So if you're 17 now and still beginning your career, it means you've never seen her work, even though she is a pioneer of dance in Egypt and dance history. If you do not have parents who were interested in the socialist project and interested in the Rida dance company, which was a radical dance company that has existed for 60 years, but of course, after the fall of the Nasser regime, they were banned from performing on big theaters. Then they just got a few nights every year at the Cairo Opera House, the new Cairo Opera House. Then later the state security thought, no, we don't need that. It's been already done and you've performed on films and everybody can just go and watch the film on vinyl. So if you are not familiar with this, again, you have no access to that segment. You have, but not easily having access to that segment. And having access means that you only see what was represented in cinema as a commercial work, but you do not get any access to the process of producing their methodology. Which then raises another question: what kind of research environment then exists in Egypt? And if Egypt is one of the largest producers of culture in the Arabic-speaking region, then what kind of research scene in the cultural and the artistic world and the Arabic-speaking world that there is? What kind of exchange could be possible within this? What parts of our history do we know? How could one announce a position? To quote Marina yesterday saying to take a position and depart from there, and how could one do this within all this amnesia, the constructed amnesia and the accidental amnesia? And what kind of accounts and narratives on art history are being written, published and disseminated? To anyone who has studied within the Ministry of Education in Egypt, in the Fine Arts Academy, at the theatre schools, in the dance school, it is very apparent that very little of this history is published in a way that could disseminate whatever theoretical revelations there was. And it's mostly oral history. So if you happen to have a theatre director who witnessed the 50s and the 60s, or the 60s and the 70s, or 70s and the 80s, then you would know more about this. Burn after hearing, because Noura also decided not to go again, because she does not want to be burnt, because she knows that the one with the camera is the one that will receive a Molotov cocktail on his or her head, which is a bit also like the one who decides to go and collect the material, or the one that decides to enter the archives and say, let's make an event, let's take these books and take them out into the public sphere. I think I'd rather stop here because I already spoke about several eras and institutions, and maybe it's a good time to just have a conversation with everybody.
Before the conversation, I need to provide a brief summary in Armenian.
Yes.
All right?
Okay, sure.
But please keep your questions in mind.
Do you want to sit up?
No, it's fine. I'll do my best to be comprehensive. Հիմա կամփոփեմ հայերեն ելույթը, կաշխատեմ արագ եւ ամբողջական ներկայացնել, ուրեմն ընդհանրապես դասախոսությունը պերֆորմատիվ պրակտիկաների, մասնավորապես օպերայի, թատրոնի եւ ընդհանրապես նաեւ գրքերի գրականության հարաբերությունն է ինստիտուցիոնալացված հիշողության եւ նաեւ պետական ուժային կառույցների քաղաքականության հետ։ Եվ ելույթը սկսվեց վիդեոարվեստագետ Նուրա Ֆարահադի նկարահանած վիդեոյով, որը 2011 թվականի դեկտեմբերի 13-ին տեսագրում էր Եգիպտոսի ինստիտուտի արխիվի հրդեհը։ Հրդեհը բռնկվել է այդպես հանկարծակի ու այդպես էլ պատճառները չեն պարզվել։ Իհարկե հրդեհողները ովքեր էլ եղել են, մի քանի այդպես մի զարկով մի քանի նապաստակ են կարծես սպանել, նախ հեղափոխականներին ու բողոքողներին են մեղադրել հրդեհի մեջ, երկրորդ մի ամբողջ այդպես հիշողության արխիվ են վերացրել, որի մեջ մտնում են նաև շատ թանկարժեք գրքեր, հնատիպ գրքեր եւ ինստիտուտը ընդհանրապես ստեղծվել է Նապոլեոնի Բոնապարտի արշավանքների ժամանակ 19-րդ դարի սկզբին եւ ֆրանսիական այդ գաղութային կայսրության ամենամեծ ու հին արխիվներից է եղել։ Եվ երրորդ իհարկե նաև փորձել են ծածկել թանկարժեք գրքերի սև շուկայի վաճառքը եւ գրքերի մի մասը շատերը նաև հանգրվանում են հիմա մասնավոր հավաքածուներում, բանկերին են պատկանում եւ այլն եւ այլն։ Եվ Աթամը եւ ընկերները փորձել են զբաղվել գրքերի փրկարարական աշխատանքներով, տեղափոխել գրքերը ազգային արխիվ, որը իր հերթին նաև այդպես պետական անվտանգության մի շատ փակ համակարգ է, որը ներխուժելու համար անհրաժեշտ է անցնել մի քանի այդպես ոստիկանական կետ, ստուգումներ անցնել եւ այլն եւ այլն։ Բայց նաև տեսագրությունը, որով սկսվեց ելույթը, մի շարք այդպես հարցեր է բարձրացնում, թե որն է, ասենք, վկայի հարաբերությունը կատարվելիքի հետ, տեսարանի հետ, երբ վկան այլևս պարզապես այդպես արտաքին դիտորդ կամ դիտող չէ, այլ նաև մասնակից, մասնավորապես երբ հենց տեսագրողի մազերը սկսել են այրվել եւ նրան հազիվ են փրկել տեսագրության ժամանակ, տեսագրելու ժամանակ։ Եվ մի փոքր այդպես պատմական ակնարկ, նաև զուգահեռ պատմական ակնարկ մշակութային հաստատությունների կառուցման, ինչպես ասենք, օպերայի տունը եւ այդպես զուգահեռ պատմություն է ծավալվում մշակութային հաստատությունների առաջացման, ստեղծման, կառուցման եւ անվտանգության համակարգի առաջ գալու հետ եւ այդ պատմությունը այդպես իհարկե սկսվում է ավելի վաղ ժամանակներից, 20-րդ դարի սկզբից, երբ Եգիպտոսը Բրիտանիայի գաղութ էր, սակայն առավել ամրապնդվում է Նասերի եւ նախագահ Նասերի եւ Սադաթի օրոք, եւ մասնավորապես Սադաթի օրոք այն դառնում է անկախ համակարգ, կատարում է ներքին գործերի դերը եւ այդպես պետական անվտանգության համակարգ է կոչվում, որ այդպես շատ խոր արմատներ ունի կյանքի, մշակութային, սոցիալական կյանքի գրեթե բոլոր ոլորտներում, իսկ արդեն Մուբարաքի կառավարման տարիներին, սկսած 89 թվականից այն ձեռք է բերում կարծես լիովին անկախություն եւ ձևավորում պետական մի համակարգ, որը կարող ենք անվանել ոստիկանական պետություն։ Եվ հենց այս համակարգն է, որ վերահսկում է մշակութային կյանքի ոլորտները, ներառյալ նաեւ օպերայի տունը, որը նախ 89 թվականին հրդեհի 70-ականներին կներեք հրդեհի պատճառով այրվել էր նաև Աթաբա հրապարակում գտնվող ազգային թատրոնը, չնայած որ երկու հաստատություններն էլ գոյություն ունեին այդպես հրշեջների հիմնական կայանատեղի նույն թաղամասում, բայց չեն փրկվել եւ կարծես այդպես անընդհատ կրկնվող պատմություն է կանխարգելվող կամ կանխարգելի հրդեհների բռնկման եւ հրդեհներ, որոնք ուղղված են հատկապես այդպես մշակութային հաստատություններին, աշխարհի գաղափարներ գրող հաստատությունների դեմ։ Եվ ինչեւ օպերայի տան 70-ականների հրդեհումից հետո նոր օպերայի տուն է կառուցվում 80-ականներին, որ ավելի շատ այդպես համալիր է հիշեցնում, իր մեջ ներառում է արդի արվեստի թանգարան, թատերական հաստատություններ, բալետի եւ թատրոնի դպրոց, որը սակայն կրկին մտնելիս թե աշխատողները, պարողները եւ թե հանդիսատեսը պետք է այդպես անվտանգության ստուգման բազմաթիվ փուլեր եւ քայլեր անցնեն, ու այդպես մի տեսակ հակասություն է ստեղծվում այդպես բարի թեթևության հետ, որ պետք է բեմադրես կամ ցուցադրես կատարես բեմի վրա եւ այն ընթացքի մեջ, որի միջոցով կարծես հասնում ես բեմ, քանի որ այդ ստուգումները անընդհատ ուղեկցվում են այդպես ռենտգենային ապարատների միջով պետք է անցնել։ Բայց նաև Մուբարաքի տարիներին մեկ այլ փոփոխություն է տեղի ունենում, եթե ասենք Նասերի եւ Սադաթի ժամանակ Կայիրեի օպերայի տնից կարող են օգտվել նաև անկախ կատարողներ, անկախ ռեժիսորներ, դերասաններ եւ այլն, ապա այժմ միայն սինդիկատների անդամ մշակութային գործիչները կարող են օգտվել այս հաստատություններից կամ ասենք պար կամ թատրոն բեմադրել եւ այլն, այսինքն տեղի ունենում նաև պետական վերահսկողության ապարատը իր այդպես բյուրոկրատական օղակներով մշակութային ոլորտը փորձում է այդպես տոտալ կառավարման ենթարկել ու այստեղից են նաև տեղի ունենում բևեռացում արվեստի երկու դաշտի միջև, մեկը հանրային, ասենք, պետական դաշտն է, որ այդպես բյուրոկրատականացված է եւ վերահսկվում է մշակույթի նախարարության կողմից, եւ մյուսը անկախ արվեստի դաշտը Կահիրեի կենտրոնական մասում ծավալվող եւ կարծես այս երկու դաշտերը միմյանցից ընդհանրապես տեղեկություն չունեն, ասենք եթե Կահիրեի օպերայի տան համալիրում այդպես շատ կարևոր ցուցահանդես է բացում 60-ականների մոդեռնիստ արվեստագետի, ապա հնարավոր է, որ անկախ դաշտի ներկայացուցիչները դրա մասին նույնիսկ չիմանան։ Հիմա աթամի դերը այն է, որ կարծես այդ երկու դաշտերի մեջ ինչ որ արանքում է հայտնվել կամ գործում է երկու դաշտերի մեջ էլ եւ իհարկե մշակույթի եւ պետական անվտանգության համակարգի սերտաճումը նաև այսօր իր դրսևորումներն է ունենում, կարծես արդեն անցյալում, ասենք իսլամական եղբայրների կառավարությունն իր հերթին փորձում էր գրաքննության ենթարկել անկախ արվեստի հաստատությունները, մասնավորապես բալետի եւ ոչ թե բալետի, այսինքն ժամանակ արդի բարի թատրոնը, որը օպերայի համալիրում գործող անկախ հաստատություն էր, եւ մի շարք այդպես քննչական ակտեր է, գործողություններ է իրականացրել եւ ի վերջո այդպես բանը հասել է նրան, որ նույնիսկ նախագահ Մուրսիի հետ դեմարտեմ զրույց է ծավալվել, երբ արվեստագետները ստիպված են եղել արդարացնել, որ պոռնոգությամբ չեն զբաղվում, երեխաներին միասեռություն չեն քարոզում եւ նաեւ արդյունավետ աշխատում են, բայց ի վերջո այդպես գաղափարաբանական արդարացումներով չկարողանալով փակել բարի դպրոցը, այն փակել են բյուջետային այդպես սուտ հիմնավորումներով, չնայած դպրոցը գործում էր պետական բյուջեից անկախ։ Այժմ թատրոնի եւ բարի աշխատողների ջանքերի շնորհիվ, բողոքների շնորհիվ կարծես անկախ թատրոնը վերականգնվում է, սակայն բեմի կուլիսների հետևում տեղադրված են տեսախցիկներ, այսինքն վերահսկողությունը շարունակվում է։ Եվ ի վերջո ընդհանուր պատմական այդպես հոծ, կարծես խիտ պատման ընդհանուր եզրակացությունն այն է, որ հիշողությունը մենաշնորհի է ենթարկվել պետական անվտանգության կառույցների կողմից եւ այդպես հրդեհի այդ բազմաթիվ կրկնվող դեպքերը հենց այդ հիշողության ջնջման փորձեր են եւ փաստորեն եթե մեկը օրինակ որ 17 տարեկան է եւ նոր է սկսում պարային իր կարիերան կարող է ընդհանրապես չիմանալ մի շատ կարևոր պարուհու Կարիմա Մանսուրի մասին, որտեղ Կարիմայի վերջին բեմադրությունը Եգիպտոսում 2004 թվականին էր եւ որևէ փաստագրություն չկա այդ մասին։ Այսինքն այդպես բազմակի ջնջումների ենթարկվել պարի եւ թատրոնի այդ շատ կատարողական արվեստների կարևոր պատմությունը եւ հարական կազմակերպություն, որ անդամն է ղեկավարում, փորձում է այժմ արխիվացնել ընդհանրապես արաբական կատարողական արվեստների պատմությունը եւ բաց մատակարարել կամ տրամադրել հանրությանը եւ ընդհանրապես հարցը այն է թե արվեստի պատմության ինչպիսի պատումներ են այսօր տարածվում, ովքեր են տարածում ուժային իշխանական ինչ տեսանկյունից այն պայմաններում եւ երբ գրավոր պատմությունը գրեթե բացակայում է եւ ընդհանուր այդպես կոնցեպտուալ կարծես առանցքը ելույթի թե ինչ կարելի է անել այն ամենից հետո երբ տեսնում ես, լսում ես ու կարդում ես հրդեհից հետո ինչ կարելի անել ընդհանրապես հրդեհից հետո պատմության եւ հիշողության տարածքում։
Now you can take the questions.
شنو
Probably my summary forget their questions.
Sorry?
My summary made people forget their questions.
To break also this silence, because I found, again, like yesterday, very interesting points, different, and maybe one thing that came to my mind is actually the way how when you have to speak about cultural institutions, this specific history that is very much connected with your work, it's actually, it's very, it's interesting that you connect this with the transformation, let's say, of the state of Egypt. So the state, that is an interesting point for us, for terms of thinking of the way how to expand the interpretations. How actually, because you could also speak from an internal point, let's say, that you have inside, but you cannot get rid in all these talks. You are coming back and forward, and we have to make a decision, because we have to ask yourself which is your political position, simply to say, what you want. This will be my question, but this is the second question. But what I found interesting is precisely this constant back and forward to the relation of the constitution of this Egyptian state, also in relation to the past, let's say to the colonies, the colonized past, that is not maybe so emphasized, that I think is a little bit a problem, and then to the formation of after the let's say freedom of the colonial past, the way of the constitution of the state, and the way how this Egyptian state is actually intervening, controlling, rearticulating the cultural field. So I thought this, what I could grasp out of your talk as something for me is precisely this interlacing of these two moments. And that is interesting. Why? Because you talk about art. And you talk all the time about how you came there, what you were doing, but actually all the time, if you want to talk, you have to talk outside of what it seems that exists, a model of culture, let's say post-Soviet, post-socialist, pro-capitalist, pro-religious, and so on. So this will be a comment also, maybe a kind of a question, if you can reflect while the others are thinking about questions.
No, simply to answer the second question, which was asked first, I am pro information being circulated. I don't know what kind of political position this could be described as, but I'm just pro information being circulated. I also believe that one cannot understand the complexity of artistic reality in a country like Egypt or in the Middle East without articulating this complex interlacing history, which is the case anywhere, but given that there is this forced forgetfulness and there's this constant erasure and reframing of things that you always thought meant one thing and suddenly they are being told that no, they meant something else. With every time the regime changes, it also reframes artistic creation constantly. And I always use the example of the Rida dance company, which in the 60s was seen as the ultimate dance company ever in the Arab world, and that what they are doing is truly a revelation, which in terms of methodology and in terms of a choreographic practice, to me it is the most inspiring dance company that ever I have seen their work in Egypt the past 60 years, whether by witnessing live or seeing videos, because of, and I'm just talking in terms of technically. But it's very interesting how this company, its work, is being reframed every few years as something completely different, and then you can't help but see that actually with this constant setting and resetting of the political milieu because of the changes of regimes or the downfall of one ideology and the rise of another one, that this should be articulated. Otherwise, the same one thing is described over and over and over, and all of these becomes layers that are shrouding a certain methodology or a certain legacy of a company that you no longer have access to it. You're just standing and it's in front of you, but then there's all these layers of dense information between you and it. So this company that was framed as a nationalist company and radically interesting choreographically, suddenly with the fall of the Nasser regime was completely ostracized from the from the public sphere, and it was not as present as it used to be in the media, because it was folkloric. As if this is a problem. And also it's very interesting because the term folkloric is rarely used by an Egyptian describing that company back at the time. If you read the texts that were written around this company at the time, if you see films where it is presented, it was just presented as dance. There was no description of it falling in the category of folkloric or ethnic or modern or contemporary. It was just dance. And it was always described as the dance company, Firqat Rida, and like the company of Rida. They don't even need to add for dance. So this one example, and then now that they have no place anymore at the Cairo Opera House, while the ballet company has a place, then you see all these changes and you can't help but relate things together. But something that I forgot to mention, and it might answer a bit the first question, which came later, is that the two ministries, the past 2.5 years since the January 2011 revolutionary events, the two ministries that have changed the position of the minister the most are, not surprisingly, the Ministry of Interior Affairs and the Ministry of Culture. And I find this very lucid, actually. And I mean, it's again part of this failing performance, this total monopoly that... and the third, right after this, is the Ministry of Information and Media. So then when you have this constant shifting, something like 7 or 8 ministers have changed so far in both culture and interior affairs. So this is when these questions just really float up to the surface. You don't even need to unearth them. Did I answer a bit?
Thank you, some other point, but just to open the discussion.
Thank you.
I have a question. Your presentation, was basically a kind of a narrativization in the sense of the difficult negotiations between culture and cultural autonomy and power, in a sense. And then wondering, like, in the way of like such negotiations, ongoing negotiations, what other power constellations do you see that, in a sense, like threaten the autonomy of the practices that you are interested in preserving, documenting, archiving, disseminating, apart from the state?
You know, it's really great that you're asking this question. I had this panic attack a few months ago when I saw the posters and the flyers of a new campaign for a new culture policy for Egypt. It's a project that is an initiative of an independent Pan-Arab Cultural Foundation that is established by an Egyptian woman. It has its seat outside of Egypt, but the office that produces cultural events, and it also runs a granting system that you could apply for. It's an application-based granting system for production of cultural performances, events, films, books, and so on. At the same time, they have always been working on cultural policy, but not as explicitly as now. And now they are running this process called a culture policy for Egypt, where they are advocating for a new culture policy. And why I had this panic when I saw the posters, because there was this poster that said in Arabic, الفن مش بس في الأوبرا, الفن حتى في شبرا, which literally means art is not just at the opera, art is also in Shubra, which is a very popular neighborhood in Egypt. So as a statement, it already comments on their relationship and the relationship of art to the opera and the opera to the nation, and Shobra, and comments on Shobra. So this, just as text, was very problematic to me. But what was even worse was the image that came with it, and it's a pity I don't have a slide for that to show, which was the image of two poor women sitting on the street, on the floor, wearing a traditional dress, and sitting and sorting out vegetables. Probably they're vegetable sellers in some market in a very impoverished area, or even in a village. I am sure, just like everybody is sure, is that these two women were not told that they are being photographed for this flyer. Because if they were told, and they would have gone through this discussion, for sure it would not matter to them a discussion on culture policy. To me, just the presentation of this image and the framing of these two subjects as the ones who truly need our work for a better culture policy, and that we are serving them while they don't know. So it's again this hegemonic position, exactly like the Ministry of Culture. And at the same time, the text is claiming to be, or promising that it will do what the ministry has failed to do. This was really so problematic because I think with this, we chatted a bit about this yesterday. When there was the sit-in around the Ministry of Culture, when the new Minister of Culture was appointed, and obviously from the Muslim Brotherhood group, and the new Minister of Culture changed all directors of everything, and then the upper house in the parliament, Majlis al-Shura, was discussing banning classical ballet because it is not a constitutional act, it's not a constitutional practice. So classical ballet should be banned, and hence dance should be criminalized. And this was happening when just before I was flying to give a talk about a dance archive. And so I was like, so my profession suddenly is being framed as something that I should be doing. And I'm doing exactly the same thing I've been doing since I was 8. And it's just insane. And then when you see this happening, and at the same time you see a sit-in of the artists working at the Opera House, for the first time deciding to politicize or realize that their practices are actually political, and they go and stage a ballet performance almost every day around the office of the Minister of Culture, to the extent that he was traumatized and described them as terrorists, this man that belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood, and then announced on the newspaper after a few days of the sit-in that he has bought and licensed a gun to protect himself and defend himself against terrorist acts, which is basically ballet. When you see this and you see the complete lack of support from the so-called independent cultural scene, that is at the same time producing statements such as art is not just at the opera, it is also in Shobra, and at the same time they're not in Shobra working on the street, then you just really see a fight of power that is happening on a level that is not addressing the people sitting on the street and selling vegetables, and is not working with them, and is also not addressing the artist's needs, because why don't you go and see why these people are enraged and standing around the minister's office? Why don't you just go and negotiate with them? Perhaps there would be a negotiation of powers that would be very exciting, which is that the independent cultural scene would decide together with the so-called state scene to just storm into the Opera House and occupy it, like literally, just go there and base their institutions there and wait for the police to come, which won't happen, and negotiate them together. I was really waiting for this moment when there would be a common decision of saying, let's storm the Opera House. There are so many studios that are closed in the Opera House, perfectly in a pristine condition, with mirrors and bars and pianos and equipment and everything you could think of, and they're just locked up. They build them and they lock them up. When I was studying dance, they decided they had extra money for some reason, and then they just built this massive building in the middle of the parking lot, which is where the modern dance company or the contemporary dance company of the Opera House is now based, and it's where the company of the Opera House, the singers, have a second studio unit of studios actually. But then there are all these studios that are closed. Why don't we then think of negotiating that, like, let the big boys have their fight and let us just go and work? So this would be another possibility of negotiation that we're yet to see, and I would be very happy with that.
I have okay, so go ahead.
If you want to ask a follow-up.
It's not a follow-up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this narrative. And I mean, this notion of the archive as a repository is, super important, as is the idea of the archive as a way of knowing, a kind of dispositif, right? A kind of epistemological framing. And I'm wondering, just thinking of, maybe this is too soon, too near, but I'm thinking of other spaces where there has been a kind of critical archive. Excuse me, Angela, to use that term that you use in art margins, but this critical archive where this kind of amnesia, constructed amnesia, opens up a possibility of a kind of critical disturbance of the archive, of how one, creates an epistemology. And I'm thinking specifically of the project of the Urbonas, Gediminas and Norbena Urbonas in Lithuania, and their kind of creation of archives, both as repositories and as epistemologies. And so how do you see this kind of void or critical amnesia as opening up to new performances of a critical archive?
Unfortunately, the fact that this is not just happening in the archives, that this is this way of dealing with memory and dealing with knowledge and how it is stored or disseminated or accessed, is also within, for instance, the curriculum of the Ministry of Culture in the Ministry of Education, excuse me. So, for instance, when the revolution happened and all the changes, and suddenly Morsi was president and the Islamists won the parliament almost exclusively to themselves, the books of primary schools on Arabic and on sciences and general knowledge changed the covers, and the images on the covers of some books had the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And even though it's not a book about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, and could be also a book not about history. So with this, you really see that the problem is way much bigger than just the National Archive on its own or the archive at the Cairo Opera House. I cannot talk in general about how this is in general being dealt with in Egypt. I mean, there are case studies of certain historians and documentaries. For example, Dr. Khalid Fahmy was just upon the change of directors of the National Archives, Dar al-Wathaiq, he insisted on giving there a lecture. So he worked very hard on having them agree that he will give a lecture there, and it was called Documents Are for the People. And the lecture was about how can we make this place accessible. And he is on his own trying to, of course with other structures, trying to see how this would work. In other initiatives, libraries, like independent libraries of collectors, so in architecture or in visual arts, in initiatives such as Cluster, which is dealing with urban studies and architecture, or in CIC, the Contemporary Image Collective in downtown Cairo. Both in Cairo, now together with other institutions, have decided to join all their libraries with one system, instead of each of them investing in a system of their own, that it is just one system. So anyone who needs to research things that are related to visual culture, urban studies, or architecture could just access this one system. I can specifically talk about how we are working on our archive, because this was a problem that we faced, given that we've decided that we should feel lucky that we were faced by this problem, because it would have been much easier if you are trying to initiate an archive in contemporary art performing arts. Would have been much easier that you access already existing archives and you just compare data, what is here, what is there, how can we connect them, so you sort of just create a network connecting them together, or some anthology or some online accessible index so that you could search, I want a document on dance in Syria, and then you know that there's one copy here and 10 there and whatever. Given that there is really no possibility of access in the case of the Cairo Opera House, or in the case of Syria, the Damascus Opera House, which is, I remember performing there, and in one of my rehearsals, the second or the third rehearsal, the third, there were these few men that I've seen every day come and really sit during my rehearsal for a few hours. And I thought they're the technical staff, that these are there in case if I need to ask someone to change the position of the light pieces, or if I need to ask where do I go and get, I don't know, a coffee or change or whatever. And then I asked the assistant of the stenographer, I said, these men are such nice people, they're ready to serve, they're here all the time. He's like, shh. And I was like, what's it? And of course we couldn't talk about it except after we've crossed avenues and avenues away from the opera house, and then she whispers, these were security. And I was like, what? And they go there every day. They attended my rehearsal. I mean, they were better than the technicians. Now and then I was angry at the technicians, like, well, where the hell are the technicians? I thought this was them. So forget it, that you get access also to the material there. So one of the artists we were trying to collect her material, May Safan, this Damascus-based choreographer, no longer Damascus-based, because they burned her studio and her material, her own archive of her work, and everybody else that she curated, because she also curated the dance platform in Syria, and threatened to kill her, and she had to leave. Then they threatened her parents and her sisters, so everybody had to leave. I cannot I cannot call the Damascus Opera House and ask for an access to their archives and have the material of May Safan when they're pretending she never existed, because they wish she never existed, and so on. So what happened eventually is that we realized that, of course, the only way to access the material is by talking to the artists. And luckily they're still alive, most of them. So while talking with the artists, because of this impossibility of accessing the material any other way, we thought this is actually fantastic, because then we ask every artist to sit for 3 interviews, every maker, so we're only interviewing the makers. Everyone sits for 3 interviews. One interview is where they have like a bird's eye view on their practice as a whole. One interview, they situate their work in the actual historical and political context. And the third interview is mainly dealing whether with the specificity of the work, or it's raising gender questions about the work in the Middle East, given just to stay there, given of course the position of a woman working in the arts in Egypt, the position of women working in the arts in general, always, like we were speaking yesterday about authorization, raises very interesting questions, and for men working in dance, it also raises very important gender questions. So yeah, in a way, the archive project and the name that we gave to the project finally was just archive, but it's interrupted, so it's arc.hive. So it's an arc that collects and carries something, and it's also a hive that is constantly generating critical substance or just material or a map. And it's also an interrupted archive because it is constantly being interrupted. It is an interrupted archive because we don't know how it will continue, given that the scope of the project is quite large, but also given that the context where we're working is practically impossible. So to us, this is how we were trying to deal with it, so it does not just become a repository where people go and know that there are shelves of things, but so that it generates, we're hoping that it will also start generating some events. So end of September is supposed to be the actual official opening of the Middle East unit, which is going to be in Cairo. And then January is the first international conference organized by the archive, where there will be lectures and events and even performances commissioned. And that's going to be in New York at the Lincoln Center.
When is that in New York?
That's in January. I don't remember the exact dates. I think 17, 18, something like that. But I can send you the information. Did I answer somehow?
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
My mom now listening.
Yeah, but the last question, okay?
Okay, then you go you, because
Maybe we
I
can
already,
pick it up.
yes, I already asked. Please, no, of course.
No,
If it's the last.
I just wanted to ask you, well, it seems to me that your practice is very much related to the context of Egypt. So I'm wondering what happens when your practice is decontextualized. How do you relate with the decontextualization of your work?
It's a great question, because I'm going to be dealing with this in the workshop later in the evening. And also the workshop could be a chance where we continue the questions, because I think Julian had a question and Maria and Angela wanted to follow. But I have, honestly, I have a very big problem with decontextualization, obviously, because I'm obsessive about things forgotten and memory and so on. Because I have been faced by a set of questions that to me are within the same order as a maker of performances, so not as someone dealing with research at all, that troubled me so much, and I had no idea how to deal with them. One question was in many of these festivals that are Arab arts and Middle East platforms and so on internationally, where, of course, it is just a displacement or I wouldn't say decontextualization now, but it is just a displacement of the work, of content, rarely contextualizing it. So, of course, then it becomes a decontextualization. And often I was told that my work is not Arab enough or Middle Eastern enough. And this was a problem for the organizers, because this would reflect on the relationship to the audience, and I don't know. And to me, this was a very major problem, honestly, because when someone tells me that I'm not Arab enough or Middle Eastern enough, I don't understand what kind of Arabness is expected. Because in general, I have a hard time understanding where does identity reside, what site of a certain entity or a product, where does it reside? Because if it's in my name or passport or my skin, well, there you go, you've got it. But if you want this to reside in my choreography, then I don't know what we're discussing really. And they were never ready for discussions. So yes, I have such a hard time as an artist displacing my work. So many of my pieces, I refuse to tour because it will be completely obsolete. So the performance corpus that I briefly mentioned yesterday, which was born because I was invited to do a performance at the Theatre of the Republic, and I told the director I would like to do a performance that you would consider impossible to present. Otherwise, it doesn't excite me, because I've been putting my shows there quite often. And he said, what would you like to do? I said, I'd like to start from two impossible questions. Can I be naked on stage in Egypt now, in 2010? And the second question, can I comment on dance history as an Arab? Can I actually go and pause it and comment on dance history, even Western European or American, or the local Arab scene, or the Cairo moment now? Can I do these two things? Because the second one was also equally impossible to him, because you are just a young Arab artist, you are not authorized. And the first one was just about having an Arab body, It doesn't matter what age or what color or what sexuality or orientation. It is just an Arab body. It cannot be naked. It cannot be naked anywhere actually, because the context of it follows you everywhere. So when I staged this in Cairo, eventually they agreed, and I staged it, and it was awarded twice, but of course never shown again in Egypt because no one wants to remember that it happened. Even though nobody sees me naked on stage because I'm naked in the dark. So you only see me naked in your mind. I told you that I'm naked, but maybe I am not naked, you know. So this was, so it was this invisible nakedness. But then, when I was asked to show it, and I showed it in several contexts, I remember when I was showing it in France, it didn't happen. I mean, I was there and I was doing the performance, but I was just really doing it as in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it didn't happen. And then I remember in the Netherlands, it was even worse. It really didn't happen. Because so much of the content is shaped by a very particular context. And when this is not lived, if it's just transported, if you know that, oh, because he cannot be naked because of the laws in his country and blah, 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 if you just know of this as questions, but you do not live it,